Father Simon and the Disciples of Judgment and Forgiveness. My confession dates back to 1998, when I was a young in-service police constable in the northeast of England. On my first day with my new shift, I was faced with a sergeant who refused to speak to me until I had proven my worth, and an inspector who was to be avoided at all times. When the inspector was on duty, it was his police station. It was his town and his police force. This was a man who joined the service in the early 70s, so discipline was his middle name. Short haircuts, clean shaves, sharply pressed uniform and smart boots, they were an absolute must. Ultimate professionalism was his goal, but unfortunately one of his constables, i.e. me, didn't share this view, and I would ultimately pay the price. Now, the late 1990s had seen a huge surge in theft from and theft of motor vehicles. Each and every constable would deal with a couple of these offences each shift, and car chases were the rule rather than the exception. One particular delinquent youth responsible for these types of crimes, we'll call him Knuckles McGinty, had been I don't think we've changed his name there. I think that he really was Knuckles McGinty. Had been arrested almost 100 times. Knuckles was causing the inspector much angst, and most night shifts began with the inspector instructing, make sure that wretched Knuckles is in the cells by midnight before he causes any more mayhem.
Yes. Great accent. Lovely.
First
of the new year. Well done.
He spoke like the Verger for no reason.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Now, at this time, a young colleague from my shift was living with his parents and therefore had plenty of spare cash. With this spare dough, he'd bought himself a shiny new Japanese sports car, which he lovingly cared for and polished every week. One night, my colleague parked his shiny new Japanese sports car in the town centre whilst he took a young lady for a night out. However, on returning to his car, he found that some horrible oik had smashed his window and stolen his stereo. This kind of thing used to happen a lot. He was incensed. How could somebody have the audacity to do such a thing to a police officer? To a police officer! Fortunately, the baddie didn't wear any gloves. The scene of crimes officer lifted several fingerprints and sent them for analysis. After a couple of weeks, this is how long it took back in the 90s, the results of the fingerprint analysis were back, and it was our very own Knuckles who had broken into our colleague's car and stolen his stereo. There was a collective frenzy on the shift as we ignored every speeding motorist, disorderly, drunk and unruly youth in our pursuit of Knuckles McGinty, determined to seek justice for our colleague. It wasn't long before I was the lucky one who arrested Knuckles and had him in the interview room. With such strong evidence, he could... Do you think this would make a good TV series?
It's going very well so far, yeah.
He couldn't deny it was he who had committed the heinous act, and he was duly charged. I then had to fingerprint Knuckles, photograph him, and take a sample of his DNA. Being 1998, there was no digital fingerprinting. These were the days of thick black ink, brass plates, and a roller to distribute the ink. A few dots of ink were put on the brass plate, then a hard roller was used to spread the ink across the plate. When all of the brass plate was covered in ink, the fingers and the thumbs would be rolled in the ink before placing the fingers and thumbs onto the paper, which would record the fingerprints. Is that clear? I think that is. This process was followed to the letter with Knuckles. Now, being a seasoned veteran of the process, Knuckles believed that his time in the fingerprint room was over. Unfortunately, it was not, because an uncontrollable urge for tomfoolery had passed over me, says Doc of Dixon Green. All done? Asked Knuckles. He hasn't spoken to this point about that.
No. Yeah.
Not quite, chummy, I replied. We've still got the ears to do. You what? He says. Well, I continued in a very stern and convincing tone, we've had a spate of burglaries recently. We've noticed that the burglars have been putting their ears against windows to listen out for whenever someone is coming. As ear prints are as unique to a person as their fingerprints, the Chief Constable has decided that we must now print the ears of everybody who's been charged with a theft. I then proceeded to firmly run the ink-rolled roller up and down Knuckles' ears until both were covered in thick black ink. I then simultaneously applied a piece of paper to either side of Knuckles' head and pressed firmly towards the centre of his head, thus producing two fantastic prints of his ears. Work of art it was. I was surprised how good they were. Even wondered if the process might become the norm. Knuckles dutifully signed his ear prints, as was the Chief Constable's instruction, and we were all finished. I directed Knuckles to the sink where there was a large tub of green swarfiga, and he proceeded to clean his hands and his ears. Unfortunately, the sink was only designed for suspects to clean their hands, so no mirror was present. Knuckles' attempt at a clean-up was reflective of the absence of a mirror, because he didn't do a very good job. As the custody process was completed, Knuckles was led to the front desk and out of the police station. Unfortunately for me, as he was walking across the car park, the inspector was just returning to the building, and their paths crossed. Moments later, the inspector entered the constable's report writing room and asked in a very stern inspector's voice, "Can anyone tell me why Knuckles McGinty is walking across my car park with fingerprint ink and swarfiga in his ears? What is going on?" The report writing room instantly emptied, and I alone was left to explain that Knuckles had been his usual naughty self in the fingerprint room, but it was no big deal as I had managed to contain the situation. I might have gotten away with this fib, but unfortunately it was at that point that the inspector looked down onto the desk and saw the beautiful ear prints which had been signed by Knuckles. I had never been called an imbecile before, and to be honest, I had to look it up in the dictionary. 3 months of winter foot patrol followed, where I was never allowed anywhere near a warm panda. I obviously don't seek forgiveness from Knuckles. It's a warm panda. It's a panda.
I've got it now. Yeah.
There aren't pandas in the northeast of England.
Please.
Had a whole different thing going on.
I obviously don't seek forgiveness from Knuckles McGinty. He was a rotter who brought misery to half the town. I do, however, seek forgiveness from the inspector who was let down by a juvenile act from a public servant who should have known better. But most of all, I seek forgiveness from Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. You might have seen her in the Crown. You see, I've been awarded a medal with the Queen's head on it. On the medal is engraved "for long service and exemplary conduct." Without forgiveness, I feel unable to ever wear this medal again, as clearly Doc of Dixon Green has had occasion when exemplary conduct was not what he was particularly famous for. Sister Bobby.
Well, just to go off on a tangent here, if Knuckles McGinty had been arrested over 100 times for twocking, why hadn't you kind of ceased this? You know, all the evidence was there. He wasn't wearing gloves, was he? So I'm just a little bit disappointed that Doc of Dixon Green hadn't kind of, you know, ceased his kind of, what's it called? You know, when you're set loose, you know, with lots
of... A crime spree?
Yes, and they'd arrested him 100 times, so why hadn't they got enough evidence to charge him?
Well,
he wasn't that smart and he wasn't that clever. So that's just going off a tangent. So I think, really, you should always follow procedure in these circumstances. Don't want to be, you know, a stickler for the rules, but I think I'm not going to forgive. I'm slightly disappointed in Doc of Dixon Green.
Yeah, well, you know, I think... I do like the picture of him with two pieces of paper on either side of Knuckles' head, getting the ear prints. What do you think there, Matthew?
Well, it's at times like these that I wonder what would Ted Hastings out of Line of Duty have thought of this. What would he have thought of this? He'd have probably thought, well, there is a grain of truth to this, isn't there? Because ear prints are, of course, or our ears are unique to us. So you know, taking an ear print isn't ridiculous. But I think it's quite clear that that Mr. Knuckles knew exactly what was going on because he brought it up with the inspector in the car park. So, you know, no harm, no foul. Everyone was fine in the end. And, yes, so I'm definitely going to forgive.